Captain Tyra Astrid had been serving with the 2nd Alpine Division for 18 months when her commanding officer first told her she was too emotional for combat leadership. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Austrian military base, its warmth doing nothing to melt the cold reception she received from her male colleagues. What they called weakness would soon become the very force that saved 400 lives in a way no military manual had ever anticipated. The alarm clock buzzed at 0500 hours, but Captain Tyra Astrid was already awake, reviewing tactical reports in her Spartan quarters at Hochfilzen Base. At 28, she possessed a mind that processed battlefield scenarios with mathematical precision and an intuition for soldier welfare that her peers found both impressive and unsettling. Her personnel files read like a textbook example of military excellence. Graduated top of her class from the Austrian Military Academy, specialized in mountain warfare tactics, fluent in 4 languages, and holder of 3 commendations for innovative training programs. But there was something about Tyra that made her commanding officers uncomfortable, something they couldn't quite articulate in official reports. Where other officers maintained emotional distance from their troops, Tyra knew every soldier's name, their family situations, their personal struggles. She remembered birthdays, checked on soldiers recovering from injuries, and had an uncanny ability to sense morale problems before they became disciplinary issues. "She cares too much," Lieutenant Colonel Klaus Weber had written in one of her early evaluations, though he'd been careful not to make it sound like criticism. "Excellent tactical mind, but tends toward emotional investment in personnel welfare. That may compromise objective decision-making under pressure." The observation stung because Tyra knew it wasn't meant as praise. In the Alpine Division's masculine culture, emotional intelligence was viewed with suspicion. Officers were expected to be analytical, detached, focused on mission objectives rather than individual soldier welfare. Tyra's approach of combining tactical excellence with genuine care for her people was seen as a character flaw rather than a leadership strength. This morning, like every morning, she conducted personal inspections of her company. Not the formal, clipboard-wielding inspections favored by other officers, but genuine conversations with the soldiers under her command. She stopped at the quarters of Private Johann Muller, a 19-year-old from Vienna who'd been struggling with homesickness. "How are you settling in, Private?" she asked, noting the exhaustion in his eyes. "Fine, ma'am," he replied automatically, but Tyra caught the slight tremor in his voice. "Johann," she said, using his first name deliberately, "I know it's hard being away from family. If you need to talk, my door is always open." The young soldier's eyes widened with surprise and gratitude. Most officers wouldn't have noticed his distress, and fewer still would have acknowledged it. This was exactly the kind of interaction that made her superiors uncomfortable, the blurring of professional boundaries that they believed weakened military discipline. In the mess hall, Tyra sat with her soldiers rather than at the officers' table, another breach of protocol that hadn't gone unnoticed. She listened to their concerns about equipment shortages, discussed their training frustrations, and shared stories that made them laugh. Her company consistently showed the highest morale ratings in the division, the lowest disciplinary problems, and the most impressive performance scores. Yet somehow, these achievements were viewed through a lens of suspicion rather than admiration. "She's too close to her people," Major Heinrich Steiner had confided to other officers. "When the shooting starts, she hesitates because she cares too much about casualties." The criticism reflected a fundamental misunderstanding of Tyra's leadership philosophy. She didn't view emotional connection as weakness. She saw it as tactical advantage. Soldiers who felt valued fought harder, communicated more effectively, and maintained better unit cohesion under pressure. Her emotional intelligence wasn't a liability, it was a force multiplier that made her company more effective than any purely technical approach could achieve. As the morning sun climbed higher over the Austrian Alps, Tyra finished her rounds and headed to the command center for the daily briefing. She moved with the confident stride of someone who knew their job exceptionally well, unaware that her commanding officer was about to deliver an assessment that would challenge everything she believed about military leadership. The mountains around Hochfilzen Base stood silent and majestic in the clear morning light, holding secrets about the extraordinary events that would soon unfold. Events that would force the entire Austrian military to reconsider what they thought they knew about strength, emotion, and the true nature of battlefield leadership. Lieutenant Colonel Klaus Weber stood at the head of the briefing room like a monument to traditional military authority. At 52, he possessed the bearing of an officer who had climbed the ranks through rigid adherence to doctrine and an unwavering belief that emotional distance was the cornerstone of effective leadership. His uniform was pressed to perfection, his gray hair precisely trimmed, and his pale blue eyes held the cold calculation of someone who viewed warfare as a chess game where individual pieces were expendable. Weber had commanded the 2nd Alpine Division for 3 years, earning respect through his tactical knowledge and fear through his rigid disciplinary standards. He was a product of the old military culture, where officers led through authority rather than inspiration, where emotional expression was viewed as unprofessional weakness, and where the chain of command was sacred regardless of the wisdom of its decisions. "Good morning," Weber announced as officers filed into the briefing room. His voice carried the crisp authority of someone accustomed to unquestioned obedience. As Tyra entered and took her seat, Weber's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. Her very presence seemed to irritate him in ways he struggled to articulate in official reports. The briefing covered routine matters, training schedules, equipment maintenance, personnel rotations. But Weber's attention kept drifting to Captain Astrid, noting the way she took detailed notes not just on tactical matters, but on issues affecting soldier welfare. When he mentioned upcoming field exercises that would require extended separation from base amenities, he watched her frown with what he interpreted as inappropriate concern for comfort rather than mission focus. "Captain Astrid," Weber said suddenly, interrupting the flow of the briefing, "I trust your company will perform these exercises without the usual accommodations you tend to arrange for your soldiers." The comment hung in the air like a challenge. Other officers shifted uncomfortably, recognizing the veiled criticism. Tyra had developed a reputation for ensuring her soldiers had adequate rest, proper nutrition, and mental health support during demanding exercises, measures that improved performance but which Weber viewed as coddling. "Sir, my company will complete all assigned objectives while maintaining optimal soldier readiness," Tyra replied professionally, though her jaw tightened slightly. Weber's smile was cold and satisfied. "Optimal soldier readiness shouldn't require emotional hand-holding, Captain. Perhaps you might benefit from observing Major Kruger's approach to leadership." Major Friedrich Kruger, seated across the table, represented everything Weber valued in an officer: cold, calculating, focused purely on mission objectives, without regard for individual soldier concerns. Kruger's company had high turnover rates, frequent disciplinary problems, and concerning levels of stress-related incidents, but these issues were viewed as acceptable costs of maintaining proper military discipline. "Of course, sir," Tyra responded, her voice carefully neutral despite the public humiliation. After the briefing, Weber lingered in the room, studying personnel files with the focused attention of someone planning a campaign. He opened Tyra's file and read through her performance evaluations, searching for ammunition to support his growing conviction that her emotional approach to leadership represented a fundamental threat to military order. The problem wasn't her competence. Even Weber couldn't deny her tactical skills or her company's impressive performance metrics. The problem was her influence. Other officers were beginning to notice that her soldiers seemed happier, more motivated, more willing to go above and beyond their basic duties. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Some were even beginning to question whether Weber's harsh, distant approach was really the most effective way to lead. Weber had built his career on the principle that military effectiveness required emotional suppression. Soldiers were tools to be deployed, not individuals to be nurtured. The mission came first, always, and personal concerns were distractions that compromised operational efficiency. Tyra's success with a completely different approach threatened the foundation of everything he believed about leadership. He pulled out a fresh evaluation form and began writing carefully chosen words that would plant seeds of doubt about her fitness for command. While Captain Astrid demonstrates technical competence, her tendency toward emotional decision-making raises concerns about her ability to maintain objectivity under combat stress. Recommend enhanced oversight to ensure mission priorities remain paramount. The words were calculated to appear reasonable while undermining her credibility. Weber understood that direct attacks on successful officers were counterproductive, but subtle suggestions about emotional instability could slowly erode confidence in her leadership. As he sealed the evaluation in an envelope marked for division headquarters, Weber felt the satisfaction of someone who believed he was protecting military standards from corruption. He couldn't see that his rigid adherence to emotional suppression was actually weakening the very institution he thought he was defending. Outside his window, the Alpine sun continued its journey across a cloudless sky, illuminating a base where two very different philosophies of leadership were about to collide in ways that would test everything both officers believed about strength, weakness, and the true nature of military excellence. The stage was set for a confrontation that would reveal which approach truly served the soldiers who depended on their leaders to bring them home alive. The first official warning came disguised as a routine policy update during Monday morning formation. Weber stood before the assembled officers, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority as he announced changes that seemed reasonable on the surface but felt targeted to those who knew how to read between the lines. Effective immediately, all company-level decisions regarding soldier welfare must be approved through division headquarters, Weber declared, his eyes briefly meeting Tyra's before moving on. This includes modifications to training schedules, special accommodations for personnel issues, and any deviation from standard operational procedures. Tyra felt her stomach tighten as she realized the implications. Her ability to respond quickly to her soldiers' needs, adjusting training when someone was struggling, arranging family communications during difficult periods, or modifying exercises to account for equipment limitations, would now require bureaucratic approval that could take days or weeks. "Sir," Tyra raised her hand respectfully, "may I ask about emergency situations where immediate welfare decisions are required?" Weber's expression hardened. "Captain Astrid, are you suggesting that your judgment supersedes established chain of command protocols?" The question was a trap, and Tyra recognized it immediately. Any response would be twisted to support Weber's narrative that she prioritized personal feelings over military discipline. "No, sir, I simply want to ensure I understand the parameters for maintaining unit readiness." Unit readiness is maintained through adherence to regulations, not through emotional decision-making, Weber replied sharply. "Perhaps you need a refresher on the distinction between leadership and friendship." The public rebuke sent ripples of discomfort through the assembled officers. Captain Elena Vasquez, who commanded the division's logistics company, exchanged a meaningful glance with Major Andreas Hoffman. Both had served long enough to recognize when new policies were designed to target specific individuals rather than improve overall operations. After formation, Sergeant First Class Maria Santos approached Tyra quietly in the corridor. Santos had served under 3 different, company commanders, and possessed the institutional knowledge that made senior NCOs invaluable to smart officers. "Ma'am, with respect, this feels personal," Santos said, glancing around to ensure they weren't overheard. "Your company has the best performance metrics in the division. The new restrictions don't make tactical sense." Tyra appreciated the sergeant's loyalty, but maintained her professional composure. "We follow orders, Sergeant." "That's what we do." "Yes, ma'am, but double." Santos hesitated, then continued. "The soldiers are already talking. They know some things. Wrong when good leadership gets punished." That afternoon, Tyra discovered the practical impact of Weber's new requirements. Private Muller approached her during training, his face pale with worry. "Ma'am, I received word that my father is in the hospital. The doctors aren't sure. Could I possibly get emergency leave to see him?" Under normal circumstances, Tyra would have immediately approved the leave and arranged transportation. Her soldiers knew she would move mountains to ensure they could be with family during crises. But Weber's new protocols required division approval for all personnel decisions. "I'll submit the request immediately, Johann," she assured him. But they both understood that immediately now meant navigating a bureaucratic maze that could take days. Tyra spent 3 hours that evening crafting a leave request that anticipated every possible objection Weber might raise. She documented the medical emergency, the soldier's exemplary service record, and the minimal impact on unit operations. When she submitted the paperwork, Weber's aide informed her that all requests required a 48-hour review period. By Wednesday, Muller's father had died while his son waited for permission to see him. The young soldier returned to base devastated, not just by his loss, but by the feeling that the military had prevented him from being where he needed to be. Tyra found him sitting alone in the barracks, staring at his phone. "I'm sorry, Johann," she said quietly, sitting beside him. "I should have found a way." "It's not your fault, ma'am," he replied, but his voice carried a bitterness that hadn't been there before. "Everyone knows what's happening. The new rules aren't about military efficiency. They're about stopping you from taking care of us." Word of Muller's situation spread through the company like wildfire. Soldiers who had once viewed military bureaucracy as an annoying but necessary evil now saw it as a weapon being used against their welfare. The trust and morale that Tyra had carefully built over 18 months began showing cracks as her ability to protect her people was systematically dismantled. Other officers watched the situation with growing unease. Captain Vasquez approached Tyra after evening mess, her expression troubled. "Elena, what Weber's doing isn't right," she said quietly. "Your leadership style works, everyone can see that. But can you say that officially?" Tyra asked, knowing the answer. Vasquez's silence was answer enough. Speaking up would mean risking their own careers to defend an approach to leadership that Weber had clearly decided to eliminate. As Tyra lay in her quarters that night, she realized that Weber's campaign was more sophisticated than simple harassment. He was systematically removing her ability to lead effectively while maintaining plausible deniability about his motives. The sunny Austrian morning that had seemed so promising now felt like the calm before a storm that was just beginning to gather strength. Weber's next move came wrapped in the language of professional development and operational efficiency. 2 weeks after implementing the welfare approval protocols, he announced a comprehensive review of all company-level leadership practices. The review would be conducted by an external evaluation team from division headquarters, with particular focus on emotional decision-making patterns that may compromise military effectiveness. The announcement was made during a routine staff meeting, but Tyra immediately understood its true purpose. While other company commanders would receive standard evaluations, her leadership style would be subjected to microscopic scrutiny, designed to find problems rather than assess performance. "The evaluation team will conduct interviews with all personnel in your company, Captain Astrid," Weber explained with false concern. They'll be looking for instances where personal feelings may have influenced professional decisions. I trust you'll cooperate fully with their investigation." The word investigation hung in the air like an accusation. Other officers avoided eye contact, understanding that they were witnessing a professional execution disguised as quality assurance. Lieutenant Colonel Weber had chosen his weapon carefully. The evaluation team consisted of officers who shared his rigid interpretation of military leadership. Major General Rudolf Brenner, the team leader, was known throughout the Austrian military for his belief that emotional expression was incompatible with combat effectiveness. His reports had ended careers before, always through carefully documented concerns about psychological fitness for command. The interviews began immediately. Brenner and his team set up in a conference room and began calling in Tyra's soldiers. One by one, the questions were designed to elicit responses that could be twisted into evidence of emotional instability. Has Captain Astrid ever made decisions based on personal feelings rather than military regulations? They asked Private Muller, still grieving his father's death. Does your commander show favoritism towards soldiers she likes personally? They questioned Sergeant Santos, who had served loyally under Tyra for over a year. Have you observed instances where Captain Astrid's emotional responses interfered with her professional judgment? Telling the truth about Tyra's caring leadership could be twisted into evidence against her. Lying would betray the officer who had consistently protected their interests. Most chose loyalty over self-preservation, praising Tyra's leadership while trying to avoid the verbal traps the evaluators set. But Weber had prepared for their loyalty. He had spent weeks documenting every instance where Tyra had bent regulations to help her soldiers. Every time she had prioritized individual welfare over strict protocol adherence. Each act of compassionate leadership was reframed as evidence of emotional instability. The case file Weber submitted to the evaluation team painted a disturbing picture of an officer whose judgment was compromised by her inability to maintain professional emotional distance. A birthday celebration for a homesick soldier became inappropriate personal boundary violations. Her practice of eating with enlisted personnel was characterized as failure to maintain proper command authority. Her detailed knowledge of soldiers' personal situations was described as excessive emotional investment that compromises objective decision-making. Major General Brenner reviewed the file with the satisfaction of someone who believed he was protecting military standards from dangerous erosion. The evidence seemed clear. Captain Astrid was emotionally unfit for command, regardless of her company's impressive performance metrics. Statistics can be misleading, Brenner explained to his team. High morale and low disciplinary problems might actually indicate a lack of proper military discipline rather than effective leadership. When soldiers are too comfortable, they may not be prepared for the harsh realities of combat. The evaluation team spent 3 days interviewing personnel and observing operations. They documented every smile, every personal conversation, every moment when Tyra showed human concern for her soldiers' well-being. Their final report would conclude that she was psychologically unsuited for military command due to excessive emotional engagement with subordinates. Meanwhile, Tyra continued performing her duties with professional excellence, unaware of the systematic character assassination being conducted behind closed doors. She noticed the stress on her soldiers' faces after their interviews, the way conversations stopped when she entered rooms, the growing tension that seemed to emanate from division headquarters. Sergeant Santos finally broke protocol and warned her directly. "Ma'am, they're not evaluating your leadership," she said during a private moment. "They're building a case against you. Every good thing you've done for this company is being twisted into evidence that you're unfit for command." Tyra felt that the world shift beneath her feet as she realized the scope of Weber's campaign. This wasn't about improving military efficiency or maintaining standards. This was a deliberate effort to destroy her career because her success threatened his worldview. What exactly are they saying, Sergeant? That you care too much, that you can't make hard decisions, that you'll break down under pressure because you're too emotionally attached to your soldiers. Santos's voice carried a mixture of anger and frustration. They're saying that everything that makes you a great leader actually makes you a liability. That night, Tyra stared at her reflection in the small mirror of her quarters, wondering if Weber might be right. Maybe her emotional approach to leadership was a weakness that would fail when it mattered most. Maybe caring too much really did compromise military effectiveness. But as she thought about Private Muller's gratitude, Sergeant Santos's loyalty, and the countless small moments when her compassion had strengthened rather than weakened her unit, she realized that Weber's campaign revealed more about his limitations than hers. The systematic destruction of her reputation was about to accelerate, but Tyra was beginning to understand that the coming battle would determine not just her career, but the soul of military leadership itself. The whispered conversations began in mess halls and barracks across Hochfilzen Base, spreading like ripples from a stone dropped in still water. Soldiers and officers who had served alongside Tyra couldn't reconcile the evaluation team's characterization of her as emotionally unstable with the competent, caring leader they knew her to be. Captain Elena Vasquez was the first to break the unofficial silence. During a logistics coordination meeting, she made a comment that would be repeated throughout the base for weeks to come. It's interesting how the Austrian military defines emotional instability, she said, her voice carefully neutral but her meaning clear. Apparently, knowing your soldiers' names and caring about their welfare is now considered a psychiatric condition. Major Andreas Hoffmann, normally cautious about involving himself in interpersonal conflicts, found himself nodding in agreement. He had commanded troops for 12 years and had never seen a company perform as consistently well as Tyra's. Her soldiers showed up early, stayed late, and tackled every assignment with enthusiasm that was rare in peacetime military service. Captain Astrid's company has the lowest sick call rates, highest training scores, and best retention numbers in the division, Hoffmann observed. If that's what emotional instability produces, maybe we need more of it. The comments spread through unofficial channels, creating a groundswell of support that Weber hadn't anticipated. Officers began sharing their own observations about Tyra's leadership, comparing it favorably to the rigid, distant approach that Weber demanded. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Dietrich, commander of the division's artillery unit, had worked closely with Tyra during joint training exercises. He had witnessed firsthand how her emotional intelligence translated into superior tactical coordination. While other officers struggled to maintain communication and morale during extended operations, Tyra's soldiers remained focused and effective, even under stress. I've seen her company perform under simulated combat conditions, Dietrich confided to a group of senior officers. Her soldiers don't just follow orders, they anticipate needs, communicate effectively, and maintain unit cohesion. Because they trust their leader completely. That's not emotional weakness. That's battlefield effectiveness. But recognition of injustice didn't translate into action. The officers who supported Tyra understood that speaking out publicly would mark them for Weber's attention. They had careers to protect, families to support, and futures that depended on avoiding conflict with division command. Sergeant First Class Maria Santos found herself in the most difficult position of all. As Tyra's senior NCO, she knew better than anyone how effective her captain's leadership style truly was. She had served under commanders who ruled through fear, others who maintained professional distance, and a few who genuinely cared about their soldiers. None had achieved the combination of high performance and high morale that characterized Tyra's command. Santos began documenting incidents that contradicted the evaluation team's narrative. When Private Fisher had struggled with mountain climbing techniques, Tyra had personally worked with him after hours until he mastered the skills. When Corporal Weber, no relation to the colonel, had received news of his wife's miscarriage, Tyra had arranged emergency leave and ensured the soldier received counseling support. When the company's communications equipment had failed during a critical exercise, Tyra had worked 18 straight hours to restore functionality while ensuring her exhausted soldiers got adequate rest. Each incident demonstrated the opposite of what the evaluation team claimed to have found. Rather than being emotionally unstable, Tyra consistently made decisions that balanced human compassion with military effectiveness. Her emotional intelligence enhanced rather than compromised her leadership capabilities. Other senior NCOs began sharing similar stories. Chief Warrant Officer Gustav Mueller, a 20-year veteran who had served with multiple units, made an observation that crystallized the growing sentiment among experienced personnel. "I've seen officers who were too soft and officers who were too hard," Mueller said during an informal gathering of senior enlisted personnel. "Captain Astrid isn't either one. She's tough when she needs to be and compassionate when it matters. That's not emotional instability, that's emotional intelligence." The support extended beyond Hochfilzen Base. Officers from other divisions who had worked with Tyra during joint exercises began making quiet inquiries about her situation. Word spread through professional networks that one of the Austrian military's most promising young officers was being targeted for elimination. Colonel Sarah Brennan, commander of the 3rd Mountain Infantry Division, had observed Tyra during a multi-unit training exercise 6 months earlier. She remembered being impressed by the way Tyra's soldiers performed, not just technically, but with an enthusiasm and initiative that spoke to exceptional leadership. "If the Austrian military considers emotional intelligence a liability," Brennan commented to her staff, "then we're preparing our officers for the wrong kind of war." But despite the growing recognition that Weber's campaign was unjust, no one felt positioned to challenge it directly. The evaluation team's report would carry official weight, while support for Tyra remained informal and unofficial. Her allies could recognize the injustice, but they couldn't prevent it from proceeding. As the evaluation period entered its final phase, Tyra found herself surrounded by sympathy but isolated from protection. The system that should have defended excellent officers from persecution was instead being used as a weapon against her, while those who knew better remained silent to protect their own careers. The stage was set for Weber's final assault on her reputation, and despite widespread recognition that injustice was being done, no one seemed willing or able to stop it. Weber's masterstroke came disguised as a routine training exercise. 3 weeks after the evaluation team submitted their preliminary findings, he announced that Tyra's company would participate in a high-stress mountain warfare simulation designed to test leadership under extreme pressure. The exercise would be conducted in the harshest terrain of the Austrian Alps, under conditions specifically crafted to create the emotional breakdown that would justify his predetermined conclusion. "This exercise will test our officers' ability to maintain objective decision-making when faced with simulated casualties and equipment failures," Weber announced during the operational briefing. His eyes found Tyra's as he continued, "It will be particularly valuable for evaluating how emotional attachment to personnel affects command judgment under stress." The trap was elegant in its simplicity. If Tyra performed well, Weber would claim, the simulation wasn't realistic enough to trigger her emotional instability. If she showed any sign of stress or made decisions prioritizing soldier welfare over mission objectives, it would be documented as evidence of her unfitness for command. The exercise scenario was brutal by design. Tyra's company would be tasked with securing a mountain pass while dealing with simulated enemy contact, equipment failures, and casualty evacuation procedures. The evaluation would focus not on mission success, but on her emotional responses to crisis situations. Major General Brenner personally designed the stress factors that would be introduced during the exercise. Simulated casualties would be selected from soldiers known to be close to Tyra. Equipment failures would occur at critical moments, requiring immediate decisions between mission continuation and soldier safety. Communication breakdowns would force her to make choices without complete information. The goal is to create conditions where her emotional weaknesses will manifest clearly, Brenner explained to Weber during a private planning session. When she prioritizes individual soldier welfare over mission objectives, we'll have the evidence we need to recommend her removal from command. Tyra understood she was walking into an ambush, but military protocol demanded her participation. Refusing would be interpreted as admission of inability to handle stress. Performing according to Weber's expectations would validate his assessment of her leadership. She was trapped in a scenario designed to destroy her regardless of her actions. The night before the exercise, Sergeant Santos approached her with intelligence gathered from contacts in other units. "Ma'am, this isn't a normal training exercise," Santos warned quietly. "They've designed it specifically to make you fail. The casualties, the equipment problems, the timeline, everything is calibrated to force you into impossible choices." Tyra appreciated the warning, but it only confirmed what she already suspected. Weber had created a no-win scenario where any decision she made could be interpreted as evidence of emotional instability. "What would you do, Sergeant?" Tyra asked, genuinely seeking advice from her most experienced NCO. "Ma'am, with respect, it doesn't matter what I would do. They're not evaluating me." Santos paused, choosing her words carefully. "But I will say this, your soldiers trust you completely. Whatever happens tomorrow, they'll follow your lead because they know you'll never sacrifice them unnecessarily." The exercise began at 0400 hours under overcast skies that threatened rain. Tyra's company moved through difficult terrain toward their objective, while evaluators positioned themselves to observe and document every decision. Hidden microphones would capture her commands and responses, while cameras would record her facial expressions and body language. During crisis moments, the first test came after 2 hours of climbing when Private Muller, still grieving his father and emotionally vulnerable, suffered a simulated ankle injury in treacherous terrain. According to the scenario, evacuation would require 4 soldiers and delay the mission by 3 hours. Continuing without evacuation would risk permanent injury to the private. Weber watched through binoculars as Tyra knelt beside Muller, her face showing concern that would later be described as inappropriate emotional investment in individual soldier welfare. She quickly assessed the situation, calculated the tactical implications, and made her decision. "Fisher Martinez, secure an evacuation site," she ordered. "Santos, establish communication with base for medical support. We continue the mission with modified timeline and reduced personnel." The decision demonstrated exactly the kind of balanced judgment that made her an effective leader, protecting her soldier while maintaining mission focus. But the evaluators documented it as evidence that her emotional attachment to personnel compromised her ability to make hard choices. The second test involved simulated equipment failure that would force her to choose between soldier safety and operational timeline. The third introduced communication breakdown requiring independent judgment. Each scenario was designed to create stress that would supposedly reveal her emotional instability. But as the exercise progressed, something unexpected began happening. Instead of breaking down under pressure, Tyra's emotional intelligence became a tactical advantage. Her deep knowledge of her soldiers' capabilities allowed her to deploy them more effectively. Her ability to maintain morale under stress kept the unit functioning at peak efficiency. Her talent for reading emotional cues helped her anticipate problems before they became critical. Weber watched with growing frustration as Tyra navigated each challenge with competence that directly contradicted his narrative. Her soldiers performed superbly because they trusted her judgment completely. Her decisions balanced multiple factors with sophistication that pure tactical training couldn't achieve. By afternoon, it became clear that the exercise was backfiring. Instead of revealing emotional weakness, it was demonstrating exceptional leadership under pressure. Weber realized he would need to escalate the scenario beyond normal training parameters to achieve the breakdown he needed to justify his predetermined conclusion. The trap was tightening, but not around the target Weber had intended. His manufactured crisis was about to reveal truths about leadership that would challenge everything he believed about military effectiveness. The final blow came 3 days after the mountain exercise concluded, delivered with the cold precision of bureaucratic assassination. Tyra was summoned to Weber's office, where he sat behind his mahogany desk with a thick file folder and the satisfied expression of someone about to claim victory in a long campaign. "Captain Astrid, I have completed my review of your performance evaluation and the recent training exercise observations," Weber announced, his voice carrying false gravity. "The findings are deeply concerning and require immediate action." The file he opened contained a carefully constructed narrative that transformed 18 months of exceptional leadership into evidence of psychological unfitness for command. Every act of compassion had been reinterpreted as emotional instability. Every successful decision that prioritized soldier welfare was characterized as mission compromise. Every moment of genuine human connection with her troops was described as inappropriate boundary violation. The evaluation team has identified a pattern of decision-making compromised by excessive emotional attachment to subordinates. Weber continued, reading from prepared text. "During the recent training exercise, you demonstrated inability to maintain objective judgment under stress, consistently prioritizing individual comfort over mission requirements." Tyra listened with growing disbelief as Weber systematically distorted the very qualities that made her an effective leader. Her knowledge of soldiers' capabilities became inappropriate personal involvement. Her ability to maintain morale under pressure was characterized as emotional manipulation that creates unhealthy dependency. Her talent for reading situational cues was described as subjective decision-making based on feelings rather than tactical assessment. "Sir, I request the opportunity to review this evaluation and provide documented evidence of my unit's performance metrics," Tyra said, her voice steady despite the shock of watching her career being destroyed by lies. Weber's smile was cold and predatory. "Captain, this isn't a negotiation. The evidence is clear and comprehensive. You have demonstrated psychological patterns that make you unsuitable for military command, particularly in combat situations where emotional decisions could result in mission failure and unnecessary casualties." The accusation hit like a physical blow. Weber was suggesting that her caring leadership style would get soldiers killed, the exact opposite of everything she had worked to achieve. Her company's safety record was exemplary, their performance metrics outstanding, their morale consistently high. Yet somehow these successes were being twisted into evidence of dangerous incompetence. The evaluation specifically notes your emotional breakdown during the mountain exercise when faced with simulated casualties. Weber continued, referencing observations that bore no resemblance to what had actually occurred. "Your inability to maintain professional distance from enlisted personnel creates tactical vulnerabilities that compromise unit effectiveness." Tyra realized with growing horror that Weber had constructed an alternate reality where her strengths were weaknesses, her successes were failures, and her caring nature was a psychiatric condition requiring treatment. The documentation was extensive, detailed, and completely disconnected from objective facts. "Furthermore," Weber added, pulling out additional papers, "multiple personnel interviews have revealed concerning patterns of favoritism, emotional manipulation, and boundary violations that create an unhealthy command climate. Your soldiers' loyalty appears to be based on personal attachment rather than professional respect." The systematic character assassination was breathtaking in its scope. Weber had taken every positive aspect of her leadership and inverted it into pathology. Her soldiers' enthusiasm became evidence of manipulation. Their trust became proof of inappropriate relationships. Their exceptional performance became indication of compromised standards. I am recommending your immediate removal from command. Pending psychiatric evaluation, Weber announced with the finality of a death sentence. The Austrian military cannot afford to place emotionally unstable officers in positions where their psychological limitations might compromise operational effectiveness or endanger personnel. The words hung in the air like poison. Psychiatric evaluation was career suicide. Even if cleared, the stigma would follow her forever. No commanding officer would risk assigning someone with documented emotional stability concerns to important positions. Sir, my company has consistently exceeded all performance standards, Tyra said, fighting to maintain composure as her world collapsed around her. Our training scores, discipline records, and readiness ratings are among the highest in the division. Statistics can be misleading, Captain, Weber replied dismissively. High morale might simply indicate insufficient military discipline. Excellent performance might reflect lowered standards rather than effective leadership. The evaluation team has looked beyond surface metrics to identify underlying psychological patterns that pose genuine risks. The bureaucratic language couldn't disguise what was happening. Weber was destroying her career using official channels to legitimize personal vendetta. Every regulation, every procedure, every protocol was being weaponized against an officer whose only crime was caring too much about the soldiers she led. When do I report for this evaluation? Tyra asked quietly, knowing that resistance would only provide additional evidence of her supposed instability. Immediately. You are relieved of command effective now. Major Kruger will assume temporary leadership of your company pending assignment of a permanent replacement. As Tyra left Weber's office, she understood that 18 months of dedicated service had been erased by lies, distortions, and systematic character assassination. Her soldiers would wake tomorrow to find their caring leader replaced by an officer who viewed them as expendable resources rather than human beings, deserving protection and respect. The Austrian military was about to learn the difference between leadership and authority, between strength and cruelty, between caring for soldiers and sacrificing them to bureaucratic convenience. The morning of Tyra's departure dawned gray and drizzling. Unusual weather for the typically sunny Austrian Alps that seemed to mirror the dark mood settling over Hochfilzen Base. She dressed in her dress uniform one final time as company commander. Every ribbon and insignia perfectly positioned despite the circumstances that made this attention to detail feel like a futile gesture of defiance. Word had spread through the barracks during the night, despite attempts to keep the command change quiet. Soldiers gathered in small groups, their faces reflecting confusion, anger, and betrayal as they processed the news that their respected leader was being removed for psychiatric evaluation. The official explanation, command restructuring for operational efficiency, fooled no one who had served under Tyra's leadership. Private Muller stood outside the administrative building as Tyra approached for her final outprocessing. His young face etched with the kind of disillusionment that ages soldiers before their time. He had lost his father while waiting for bureaucratic approval, and now he was losing the only officer who had shown genuine concern for his welfare. "Ma'am, this isn't right," he said quietly as she passed, his voice carrying the weight of institutional betrayal. "Everyone knows this isn't right." Other soldiers lined the hallway leading to the administrative offices, not in formation but in spontaneous demonstration of respect for a leader they were losing to political maneuvering. Sergeant Santos stood at attention as Tyra approached, her face a mask of professional composure that couldn't hide the anger burning in her eyes. "Company's ready for inspection, ma'am," Santos announced, her voice carrying formal protocol and personal devotion in equal measure. "Stand easy, Sergeant," Tyra replied, using the familiar command one last time. "Take care of them. They deserve better than what's about to happen." The processing itself was conducted with bureaucratic efficiency that stripped away her authority. One signature at a time. Her access codes were revoked, her command responsibilities transferred, her security clearances suspended pending psychiatric evaluation. Each document she signed felt like another nail in the coffin of her military career. Major Kruger arrived to formally assume command with the cold professionalism that Weber valued above all other qualities. He reviewed Tyra's meticulously maintained files with obvious disdain for the personal touches that made her leadership so effective. Detailed notes about soldier welfare, family situation updates, individual development plans that went far beyond regulatory requirements. This level of personal involvement is inappropriate for military command, Kruger observed, discarding files that represented hundreds of hours of Tyra's investment in her soldiers' well-being. We'll be returning to proper professional distance immediately. The comment crystallized everything wrong with the system that was destroying her. Kruger viewed caring as contamination to be cleaned away rather than strength to be preserved. The soldiers she had nurtured would be reduced to numbers on personnel rosters, their individual needs subordinated to rigid adherence to regulations that prioritized process over people. Weber appeared as Tyra completed her final paperwork. His presence clearly intended to witness her humiliation firsthand. He stood in the doorway with the satisfied expression of someone who believed he had protected the Austrian military from dangerous corruption. Captain Astrid, your psychiatric evaluation is scheduled for this afternoon, he announced with false concern. The military medical facility in Innsbruck will conduct a comprehensive assessment of your fitness for continued service. The threat was unmistakable. Psychological evaluations could be manipulated to support predetermined conclusions, especially when the evaluating psychiatrist understood what answers their superiors wanted to hear. Even if Tyra passed the evaluation, the mere fact of undergoing psychiatric review would mark her as damaged goods in a military culture that prized emotional suppression above all else. As she prepared to leave the base, Tyra walked past the company area where her former soldiers were beginning morning training under Kruger's rigid supervision. The contrast was immediately apparent. Where her formations had buzzed with quiet energy and mutual respect, Kruger's assembly radiated tension and resentment. Private Fisher approached her car as she loaded her personal belongings, his face reflecting the bewilderment of a young soldier watching institutional betrayal unfold in real time. "Ma'am, what should we do?" he asked, his voice carrying desperation that broke Tyra's heart. "How do we serve under someone who doesn't care about us?" The question encapsulated everything tragic about her removal. These soldiers had learned to expect leadership that valued their humanity alongside their military effectiveness. Now they were being forced back into a system that viewed caring as weakness and emotional distance as strength. "Serve with honor," Tyra replied, her voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm her composure. "Remember that excellence matters, that integrity has value, and that how you treat each other defines who you are as soldiers." As she drove away from Hochfilzen Base, Tyra watched the mountains disappear in her rearview mirror and tried to reconcile herself to the destruction of everything she had worked to build. Her soldiers would learn to suppress their expectations of caring leadership. Her innovative approaches to morale and welfare would be eliminated in favor of rigid protocol adherence. Her 18 months of building trust and excellence would be erased as if they had never existed. Weber had won completely. He had eliminated a threat to his rigid worldview while maintaining plausible deniability about his motives. The Austrian military would return to the comfortable mediocrity of emotional suppression, where officers led through authority rather than inspiration and soldiers were resources to be managed rather than people to be protected. But as the sun broke through the clouds ahead of her, Tyra couldn't know that her story was far from over. She couldn't see the consequences her removal would trigger, the extraordinary events that would unfold in her absence. or the way her quiet dignity in defeat would ultimately expose the bankruptcy of the system that had destroyed her. Sometimes, the most powerful victories begin with apparent defeat, and sometimes the greatest leaders reveal their true strength only after they've been stripped of their authority. The crisis that would expose Weber's catastrophic judgment began 72 hours after Tyra's removal, during what should have been a routine mountain patrol exercise. Major Kruger had designed the operation to demonstrate proper military efficiency, no personal touches, no emotional considerations, just cold tactical execution that would prove his superiority over his predecessor's soft approach. The patrol consisted of 2 squads conducting reconnaissance in the treacherous terrain near the Italian border, an area known for sudden weather changes and difficult navigation. Under Tyra's leadership, such operations included detailed individual briefings, equipment checks that accounted for each soldier's specific needs, and contingency plans that considered human factors alongside tactical requirements. Kruger eliminated these inefficiencies in favor of streamlined procedures that focused purely on mission objectives. Soldiers received standard briefings regardless of experience level. Equipment was distributed according to regulation rather than individual requirements, and contingency planning focused on tactical scenarios rather than personnel welfare. Disaster began with a communication failure that severed contact between the patrol and base operations. Standard protocol required the patrol to continue their mission while attempting to restore communications, but the specific circumstances demanded judgment that went beyond regulatory compliance. Corporal Weber ironically sharing the colonel's surname was the patrol's most experienced navigator, but he had been struggling with altitude sickness symptoms that Tyra would have recognized and addressed before deployment. Under her leadership, he would have been paired with additional support or assigned to a different role. Kruger's system treated him as an interchangeable resource, ignoring human factors that could compromise mission effectiveness. When the weather deteriorated rapidly, a common occurrence in alpine conditions, the patrol found themselves trapped in terrain they couldn't navigate safely. Corporal Weber's impaired judgment led to a critical navigation error that put both squads in immediate danger. What should have been a manageable situation became a life-threatening crisis because the human elements that Tyra always considered had been systematically ignored. Private Muller, still grieving his father and psychologically vulnerable from recent events, experienced a panic response that compromised his ability to function effectively. Under Tyra's leadership, his emotional state would have been monitored and supported before deployment. Kruger's approach treated psychological readiness as irrelevant to operational planning. The combination of communication failure, navigation error, and personnel breakdown created a cascading crisis that threatened to destroy both squads. Soldiers who had learned to expect caring leadership found themselves abandoned by a system that viewed their individual needs as tactical irrelevance. Sergeant Santos, monitoring communications from base operations, immediately recognized the significance of the silence. Her years of experience with mountain operations told her that routine communication failures quickly became life-threatening emergencies in alpine conditions. "Sir, we need immediate search and rescue deployment," she informed Kruger. "Weather conditions are deteriorating, and the patrol's last known position puts them in avalanche-prone terrain." Kruger's response reflected the cold calculation that Weber had praised as superior leadership. "Sergeant, the patrol has clear orders and adequate equipment. We don't deploy rescue operations for routine communication problems." The dismissal revealed everything wrong with leadership that prioritized process over people. Santos understood that those soldiers were facing conditions that required immediate intervention, but Kruger's rigid adherence to protocol prevented him from recognizing human factors that could prove fatal. Word of the crisis spread through the base with the speed of institutional panic. Officers and NCOs who had served with Tyra immediately understood what was happening, Soldiers were dying because caring leadership had been replaced by bureaucratic indifference. Captain Vasquez approached Kruger directly, her voice carrying urgent concern. "Major, I've operated in that terrain during winter conditions. We need search and rescue deployment now, before weather makes intervention impossible." "Captain, I don't require tactical advice from logistics personnel," Kruger replied dismissively. "The patrol will execute their mission according to established procedures." But established procedures hadn't accounted for the human factors that Tyra would have recognized and addressed. The patrol was trapped not just by weather and terrain, but by a leadership philosophy that treated soldiers as expendable resources rather than human beings, deserving protection. As hours passed without communication, the base atmosphere grew increasingly tense. Soldiers who had served under Tyra's caring leadership watched their comrades face mortal danger while rigid protocol prevented effective response. The unprecedented action began with a single decision by Sergeant Santos. Faced with leadership that prioritized regulations over lives, she chose to violate direct orders and contact Colonel Brennan's Mountain Rescue Unit directly. "Ma'am, we have soldiers in immediate danger, and Division Command is refusing deployment," she reported, her voice carrying the weight of someone choosing conscience over career survival. The call would trigger a chain of events that would expose Weber's entire campaign as the institutional catastrophe it truly was. But first, brave soldiers would have to survive conditions that proper leadership could have prevented. While their supposed protectors debated regulatory compliance instead of mounting rescue operations, the Austrian military was about to learn that emotional intelligence wasn't weakness. It was the difference between bringing soldiers home alive and sacrificing them to bureaucratic pride. Within 6 hours of Sergeant Santos's unauthorized call for help, something unprecedented began happening across the Austrian military. Word of the trapped soldiers and the refusal to deploy rescue operations spread through informal networks that connected bases throughout the country. Officers who had served with Tyra, NCOs who understood her leadership philosophy, and soldiers who had witnessed the difference between caring and indifferent command began taking actions that would redefine military protocol. Colonel Sarah Brennan of the 3rd Mountain Infantry Division received Santos's plea and immediately grasped the situation's gravity. She had observed Tyra's leadership during joint exercises and understood that the current crisis represented everything wrong with Weber's rigid approach to command. "We're deploying search and rescue immediately," Brennan announced to her staff, her voice carrying the authority of someone willing to risk career consequences for soldier welfare. "Authorization will follow action, not precede it." The decision violated chain of command protocols, but Brennan understood that bureaucratic compliance meant accepting preventable deaths. Her mountain rescue teams were the most experienced in Austria, and delay meant losing soldiers to conditions that proper leadership could have avoided. Simultaneously, Captain Vasquez at Hochfilzen Base made her own unprecedented decision. Frustrated by Kruger's continued refusal to acknowledge the crisis, she contacted every officer in her network who had served with Tyra, creating an informal coalition focused on soldier rescue rather than regulatory compliance. "We have an opportunity to demonstrate what real military leadership looks like," she told Captain Elena Martinez during a secure call. "Tyra taught us that soldiers matter more than procedures. Now we prove it." The response spread with viral intensity. Officers across Austria began offering resources, personnel, and equipment for the rescue operation, despite having no official authorization. Transport helicopters from 3 different bases converged on the search area. Medical teams prepared for casualty evacuation. Communication specialists worked to establish contact with the trapped patrols. Major Andreas Hoffmann, commanding the division's logistics unit, made a decision that encapsulated the growing movement. He ordered emergency supply drops to the search area without requisition approval, understanding that bureaucratic delays could prove fatal. "Court-martial me later," he told his subordinates. "Right now, soldiers need supplies to survive." The convergence of resources created an unprecedented situation where multiple units were operating outside official channels to accomplish what rigid command structure had failed to achieve. Weber watched with growing alarm as his carefully maintained authority disintegrated in favor of informal networks focused on soldier welfare. "This is insubordination," he declared during an emergency briefing with his staff. "These officers are violating chain of command and undermining military discipline." But his staff officers, many of whom had privately questioned his treatment of Tyra, no longer seemed convinced by his arguments. They could see the dramatic contrast between rigid protocol and effective action, between bureaucratic compliance and soldier protection. Lieutenant Colonel Dietrich, commander of the artillery unit, finally voiced what many were thinking. "Sir, with respect, soldiers are trapped in life-threatening conditions while we debate authorization procedures. Perhaps military discipline should prioritize saving lives over protecting protocol." The comment represented a seismic shift in military culture. Officers were openly questioning whether adherence to regulations served military effectiveness or simply protected authority figures from accountability. Meanwhile, news of the crisis reached Austrian Defense Ministry headquarters, where senior officials began demanding explanations for the communication breakdown, the rescue delay, and the unauthorized mobilization of resources. General Patricia Kellner, Chief of Staff of the Austrian Armed Forces, requested immediate briefings on the Hochfilzen situation. The investigation that followed would expose the systematic campaign against Tyra, the fabricated psychological evaluation, and the dangerous leadership philosophy that had created the current crisis. But first, the rescue operation had to succeed in demonstrating that caring leadership produced superior results. By midnight, over 200 personnel from 8 different units were involved in the search and rescue operation, all operating outside official authorization but within the moral framework that Tyra had taught them. The movement had grown from one sergeant's courageous decision into a military-wide demonstration of what leadership looked like when it prioritized soldier welfare over bureaucratic convenience. Weber's authority was crumbling as officers throughout Austria chose conscience over compliance, proving that Tyra's influence extended far beyond her former company. The systematic destruction of her career had inadvertently created a network of leaders committed to the principles she represented. The unprecedented response was exposing fundamental truths about military effectiveness that Weber's rigid worldview couldn't accommodate. Real strength came from caring about soldiers deeply enough to risk everything for their protection. True military discipline meant choosing mission success over personal protection. Authentic leadership meant inspiring others to exceed normal limitations rather than forcing compliance through fear. As dawn approached over the Austrian Alps, the rescue operation continued with intensity that transcended normal duty requirements. Powered by the understanding that how institutions treat their most vulnerable members reveals their true character. The breakthrough came at 0630 hours when rescue teams finally established contact with the trapped soldiers. The voice that crackled through the emergency radio belonged to Corporal Weber, weak but determined as he reported the patrol's desperate situation to the search teams that had worked through the night to find them. "Base, this is Alpine 7, Weber transmitted, his words carrying the weight of 18 hours spent fighting for survival in conditions that should have killed them all. "We have 2 casualties requiring immediate evacuation, but all personnel are alive. Repeat, all personnel are alive." The radio transmission was heard simultaneously across multiple bases as dozens of units monitored the emergency frequency. Cheers erupted in communication centers throughout Austria as soldiers and officers celebrated news that the rescue operation had succeeded despite official obstruction. But the real revelation came in Weber's after-action report, delivered as rescue helicopters evacuated the wounded soldiers to medical facilities. The corporal's account would shatter every assumption about emotional leadership and tactical effectiveness that his namesake colonel had used to justify Tyra's destruction. "Sir, we survived because Captain Astrid taught us to take care of each other," Weber reported to Colonel Brennan as medics treated his frostbite injuries. "When Private Muller panicked, we used the calming technique she showed us. When navigation failed, we fell back on the buddy system she drilled into us. When hypothermia threatened, we shared body heat the way she taught us during survival training." The revelation was devastating to Weber's narrative. The soldiers had survived not despite emotional leadership, but because of it. Tyra's emphasis on psychological readiness, mutual support, and human factors had provided exactly the tools needed for survival when rigid protocol proved inadequate. Sergeant Santos, who had risked her career to initiate the rescue operation, listened to the report with vindication that felt like physical relief. "Ma'am, they're alive because she taught them that caring about each other isn't weakness, it's tactical advantage." The rescued soldiers told a consistent story that demolished every criticism leveled against Tyra's leadership style. When official systems failed, her emphasis on psychological resilience had prevented panic. When equipment broke down, her cross-training programs had ensured redundant capabilities. When conditions became life-threatening, her focus on unit cohesion had inspired sacrificial behavior that kept everyone alive. Private Muller, whose panic attack could have endangered the entire patrol, described how Tyra's emotional intelligence training had ultimately saved lives. "She taught us that fear is normal, that acknowledging it doesn't make you weak, and that helping each other through difficult emotions makes the unit stronger. When I lost control, my teammates knew how to help me recover instead of just telling me to tough it out." The contrast with Kruger's leadership philosophy couldn't have been starker. His rigid suppression of emotional considerations had created the conditions that made the crisis inevitable, while Tyra's emphasis on psychological readiness had provided the tools necessary for survival. News of the successful rescue and its implications spread throughout the Austrian military with explosive speed. Officers who had remained silent during Tyra's persecution now understood that her removal had been based on fabricated concerns that were contradicted by objective evidence. General Kellner arrived at Hochfilzen Base within hours of the rescue, her presence signaling that the situation had attracted attention from the highest levels of Austrian military command. The general's reputation for thorough investigation and intolerance for institutional corruption preceded her arrival. Weber found himself summoned to explain not just the rescue delay, but the entire sequence of events that had led to the crisis. His carefully constructed narrative about emotional instability began crumbling under scrutiny from officers who understood that good soldiers had nearly died because of his leadership philosophy. "Colonel Weber, explain to me why rescue operations were delayed while soldiers faced life-threatening conditions," General Kellner demanded, her voice carrying the cold authority of someone accustomed to holding commanders accountable for their decisions. Weber's attempt to justify the delay revealed the bankruptcy of his entire approach. "Ma'am, proper protocol requires authorization before deploying resources. We cannot allow emotional responses to override established procedures." "Colonel, what I see is that emotional responses by multiple officers saved lives that your protocols would have sacrificed," Kellner replied sharply. "Perhaps you should explain why you consider soldier welfare an inappropriate emotional response." The investigation that followed would expose not just Weber's treatment of Tyra, but the systematic failure of leadership that had prioritized bureaucratic compliance over soldier protection. The unprecedented response to the crisis had demonstrated what military effectiveness looked like when caring leadership was protected rather than persecuted. Officers throughout Austria watched with fascination as the institutional order that had seemed unshakable proved vulnerable to the simple demonstration that soldiers mattered more than regulations. The rescue operation had become more than tactical success. It had become proof that Tyra's approach represented the future of military leadership. Weber's campaign against emotional intelligence had created exactly the crisis it claimed to prevent. While Tyra's emphasis on caring leadership had provided the solution that saved lives, the Austrian military was about to undergo the most fundamental transformation in its modern history, all because one sergeant had chosen conscience over compliance and dozens of officers had chosen soldier welfare over career protection. Unprecedented climax had revealed that true military strength came not from suppressing emotion, but from channeling it effectively in service of mission accomplishment and soldier protection. The investigation that followed the Alpine rescue exposed a web of deception so systematic and damaging that it would reshape Austrian military policy for generations. General Kellner's forensic examination of Weber's campaign against Tyra revealed evidence of institutional corruption that extended far beyond personal vendetta into dangerous incompetence that had nearly cost lives, the psychiatric evaluation that had been used to justify Tyra's removal was the first domino to fall. Dr. Franz Müller, the military psychiatrist who had conducted the assessment, admitted under questioning that he had been pressured to reach predetermined conclusions. Weber had provided the evaluation framework and expected results before the examination ever took place. I was told that Captain Astrid exhibited emotional instability that compromised her command effectiveness, Dr. Müller testified during the formal inquiry. When my actual evaluation found no evidence of psychological impairment, I was instructed to reconsider my findings in light of operational concerns that weren't apparent to medical examination. The revelation that Tyra's psychiatric evaluation had been predetermined rather than objective destroyed the foundation of Weber's case against her. Every subsequent action, her removal from command, the restrictions on her military service, the damage to her reputation had been based on deliberately falsified medical assessment. Captain Elena Vasquez provided crucial evidence about the systematic manipulation of personnel records. As logistics officer, she had access to performance metrics that contradicted every claim in Weber's evaluation of Tyra's leadership. The documentary evidence was devastating to Weber's credibility. Captain Astrid's company consistently outperformed all others in the division. Vasquez testified, presenting detailed statistics that Weber had deliberately omitted from his reports. Training scores, disciplinary incidents, retention rates, morale assessments, every measurable metric indicated superior leadership effectiveness. The investigation also revealed that Weber had suppressed positive evaluations from other officers who had worked with Tyra. Lieutenant Colonel Dietrich's glowing assessment of her tactical coordination during joint exercises had been buried in administrative files. Colonel Brennan's commendation for her innovative training programs had been removed from her official record. Most damaging was the discovery that Weber had been systematically undermining other competent officers who threatened his authority. Tyra wasn't his first victim, she was simply the most successful target in a pattern of institutional destruction that had driven talented leaders from Austrian military service. The evidence painted a clear picture of a commander who viewed competence as competition and emotional intelligence as contamination. Weber's rigid adherence to authoritarian leadership had created a toxic environment where excellent officers were punished for caring about soldier welfare. General Kellner's interim report was scathing in its assessment of Weber's leadership and its consequences. The systematic persecution of Captain Astrid represents institutional failure of the highest magnitude. Her removal was based on fabricated evidence, falsified evaluations, and deliberate suppression of her superior performance. But the most powerful evidence came from the soldiers themselves. When given opportunity to testify without fear of retaliation, they provided consistent accounts of how Tyra's leadership had prepared them for exactly the kind of crisis they had survived in the Alpine rescue. Private Muller's testimony was particularly compelling. Captain Astrid didn't make us weak by caring about our welfare. She made us stronger by teaching us to care about each other. When I was trapped and panicking, my teammates knew how to help me because she had trained us that taking care of each other was part of military effectiveness, not separate from it. The investigation also examined the rescue operation itself, revealing how informal networks created by Tyra's influence had achieved what formal command structure had failed to accomplish. Officers trained in her approach to leadership had demonstrated superior crisis response, precisely because they prioritized soldier welfare alongside mission accomplishment. Sergeant Santos received official commendation for her decision to violate orders and initiate rescue operations. Her courage in choosing soldier protection over bureaucratic compliance had prevented what could have been the Austrian military's worst peacetime disaster. Sergeant Santos exemplified the finest traditions of military leadership by recognizing that true discipline means protecting soldiers, even when regulations create obstacles to their survival. General Kellner noted in her citation that the truth that emerged from the investigation was more than vindication for Tyra, it was validation of an entirely different approach to military leadership. Her emphasis on emotional intelligence, soldier welfare, and human factors had proven tactically superior to rigid adherence to protocol and emotional suppression. Weber's carefully constructed campaign had backfired completely. Instead of eliminating emotional leadership from the Austrian military, his persecution of Tyra had demonstrated its essential value. The crisis he created had proven that caring deeply about soldiers enhanced rather than compromised military effectiveness. The final revelation was perhaps the most damning. Internal communications recovered from Weber's files showed that he had been aware of the fabricated nature of his case against Tyra, but had proceeded anyway because he believed eliminating her influence was worth sacrificing truth. His willingness to destroy an excellent officer to protect his own worldview represented institutional corruption of the most dangerous kind, the sacrifice of military effectiveness to preserve personal authority. As the investigation concluded, it became clear that Weber's campaign had accomplished exactly the opposite of its intended effect. Instead of proving that emotional leadership was dangerous, it had demonstrated that suppressing emotion in military command created the very problems that caring leadership could prevent. The truth was emerging, and with it came the recognition that the Austrian military needed fundamental reform to prevent such institutional failures from recurring. 2 years later, Colonel Tyra Astrid stood before the Austrian War College, delivering a lecture that would become mandatory reading for every officer in the military. The promotion had come with unprecedented speed, accompanied by assignment as Director of Leadership Development, a position created specifically to institutionalize the lessons learned from what historians were already calling the Hochfilzen crisis. The lecture hall was packed with officers from across Europe, drawn by the remarkable story of how one woman's emotional instability had saved hundreds of lives and transformed military leadership doctrine. Tyra's journey from psychiatric evaluation to colonel's rank in 18 months represented the most dramatic vindication in Austrian military history. "Leadership isn't about suppressing emotion," she began, her voice carrying the authority earned through adversity survived and wisdom gained. "It's about understanding that emotion, properly channeled, becomes the force that transforms good soldiers into exceptional ones and adequate units into elite formations." The audience included Weber, now serving as a training officer at a remote outpost. The only position offered after his catastrophic judgment had nearly resulted in the loss of an entire battalion. His rigid adherence to emotional suppression had created the very crisis he claimed emotional leadership would cause. Kruger had been quietly transferred to administrative duties after his failure to recognize the human factors that led to the mountain disaster. His cold, protocol-driven approach had proven disastrously inadequate when human lives hung in the balance. The soldiers who survived the Alpine crisis did so because they remembered lessons learned under caring leadership. Tyra continued her words carrying weight that transcended rank or regulation. They supported each other, made sacrificial decisions for their comrades, and maintained hope because they had experienced leadership that valued their humanity alongside their military effectiveness. The rescue operation that had saved the trapped soldiers had become a case study in military academies worldwide. When official channels failed due to bureaucratic rigidity, informal networks activated by Tyra's former soldiers had mobilized resources that proved the difference between life and death. Sergeant Santos, now Sergeant Major Santos, had received the Austrian Military Cross for her decision to violate orders and contact rescue units directly. Her courage in choosing soldier welfare over career protection had inspired a generation of NCOs to prioritize substance over process. What we learned from the Hochfilzen crisis, Tyra explained to the assembled officers, is that emotional intelligence doesn't compromise military effectiveness, it enhances it. Leaders who understand their soldiers' psychological state, who recognize stress indicators, who balance mission requirements with human factors, consistently achieve superior results. The transformation had been remarkable. Austrian military doctrine now emphasized emotional intelligence as a core leadership competency. Officers were trained to recognize the difference between caring and weakness, between emotional awareness and emotional instability. The military had discovered that its greatest strength lay not in suppressing humanity, but in channeling it effectively. Private Muller, now Corporal Muller, served as an instructor in the new leadership program, sharing his experience of how caring leadership had saved his life twice, once psychologically when he lost his father, and once literally when he was trapped in the mountains. His story had become emblematic of how emotional intelligence translated into tactical advantage. The changes extended far beyond Austria. NATO allies had studied the Hochfilzen crisis and implemented similar reforms. Military leadership programs worldwide now included modules on emotional intelligence, psychological readiness assessment, and the integration of human factors into tactical planning. Excellence protected and nurtured becomes the foundation upon which military effectiveness stands, Tyra concluded, using words that had become the motto of the new leadership doctrine. When we protect officers who care deeply about their soldiers, we create institutions that attract the best people and inspire them to achieve extraordinary things. The applause that followed wasn't merely professional courtesy. It was recognition of transformation achieved through courage maintained during the darkest moments of professional destruction. Tyra had proven that integrity, properly defended, could reshape institutions, and that caring leadership, when protected rather than punished, could save lives in ways that pure tactical training never could. After the lecture, young officers approached with questions that revealed how profoundly military culture had changed. They asked about balancing mission requirements with soldier welfare, about reading emotional cues in high-stress situations, about creating unit cohesion through genuine care rather than imposed discipline. That evening, Tyra stood on the balcony of her quarters overlooking the same Alpine peaks where her career had nearly ended. The sun was setting in brilliant colors that painted the mountains gold and amber, a reminder that even the darkest storms eventually give way to light. She thought about Weber's attempt to destroy her, about the systematic character assassination that had nearly succeeded, about the moment when her career seemed lost forever. But she also thought about the soldiers whose lives had been saved, because caring leadership had taught them to value each other's survival, about the institutional changes that would protect future officers from persecution, and about the young leaders who now understood that strength and compassion weren't contradictory qualities. The Austrian military had learned that its greatest victories weren't won through superior firepower or advanced technology, but through superior character expressed in leaders who understood that protecting soldiers wasn't weakness, it was the highest form of military strength. Weber's attempt to eliminate emotional intelligence from military leadership had instead proven its essential value. His campaign of destruction had ultimately strengthened the very institution he thought he was protecting. As stars appeared in the darkening sky, Colonel Tyra Astrid smiled at the recognition that sometimes the most important battles aren't won through force, but through the quiet dignity of those who refuse to sacrifice their humanity for institutional convenience. Her rage had indeed saved a battalion, not through violence, but through the courage to care deeply in a system designed to punish caring, proving that the most powerful weapon any military possesses is leaders who understand that bringing soldiers home alive requires understanding the full spectrum of human strength. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.